Once you were old enough, what were the dark family secrets you were finally let in on? Got a Facebook message from one guy asking if I was related to my dad, since it's not a common last name. I thought he was a fan of his work because I was in college at the time and the guy was about the same age as me. And that's how I found out my dad slept around and that I had a half brother the same age as me. My grandfather killed his youngest brother to get out of going to Vietnam. He, his brother, and two of their friends had their numbers called in the draft for Vietnam. They didn't want to go, obviously, but they didn't come from money and or work to support their families. If they got arrested they'd lose their jobs and their families would lose their income. So they decided on a different plan to get out of going. They would drive to get their medical checks together, and on the way there they would drive the car into a tree. The plan was to get too injured to get sent to war, but not so injured as to be permanently crippled, and it had to look like an accident so nobody got arrested. This was in country Western Australia, so they were all going to say they swerved to miss a kangaroo and hit the tree. My grandfather was driving, his friend was in the passenger seat, and the other two were in the back. His brother was behind the passenger seat. They hit the tree doing about 40 km/h, enough to be serious. A broken leg for my grandfather, a broken arm for the guy behind him, and broken ribs all around. They definitely weren't going to war. The problem was that for maximum impact, and because this was rural Australia in the 60s, they weren't wearing seatbelts. And nobody found them, or their car for an hour or so. And nobody considered internal injuries in this plan. And my grandfather's brother bled to death from a ruptured spleen in the back seat. He was dead before they got to a hospital. My grandfather never forgave himself, and he never talked about it. My grandma was the only one he ever told, as far as we know, and she didn't tell my mother and I until long after his death. We found a small box in their bedroom when we were cleaning out the house after she died last year. It had a clipping from the local newspaper at the time about the accident. It said that they had swerved to miss a roo and called it a tragedy. I don't think my mother told any of her siblings, so technically this is still the family secret. I guess now you're all in on it. Not very much a secret, but took me until I was older to understand what was happening. My mom would sometimes have us play a game called Army, which consisted of me, my mom, and my siblings army crawling around our apartment. Kind of a hide and seek style game. She would yell hit the deck randomly and we would all drop and find a hiding spot. We would giggle and giggle while my mom army crawled around looking for us. We loved the game so much. I realized a few years ago, while retelling the story, that we lived in a really terrible neighborhood, and she would yell it out when she heard gunshots outside the building. I'm assuming she was worried about stray bullets. Edit, I shared everyone's amazing comments with my mom, and she shed a tear. She feels very appreciated on International Women's Day today. Your mom is a ducking G. My father met my mother in the Philippines when he was stationed there in the Navy. He married her there and conceived me. He went away to finish his tour of duty. My mother moved to America when she was a month away from giving birth to me. She moved in with relatives in Texas. My father's tour ended while he was in Hawaii. He met a woman there and called my mom in America asking for a divorce. He wanted to take back his recent marriage to her with a kid on the way because he had a hot one-night stand. My mother was already scared, being in a new country, not knowing much English. Add to this that she was pregnant, about to give birth, and her husband was dumping her. My Texan uncle got on a plane to Hawaii, prepared to kick my father's ass. He somehow talked my father into being a man and taking responsibility for his wife and child. The fact that the fling dumped his ass surely helped. He was back by the time I was born. I learned all this when I was 11, around the time my parents got divorced. It was only the first of countless dark family secrets I would come to learn during my teenage years. This might be the first story I read here where the uncle is the good guy in the teller's point of view. My grandfather got out of serving in Vietnam by robbing pharmacies and going to jail for years. Wow. Mine got out of it by telling the Navy that he could type, so he remained stateside and typed reports or something for his unit. He said he was one hell of a two-fingered typist. My grandmother tried to murder my grandfather when she got sick of him beating the shit out of her every day. She swung an axe at him and he blocked it with his hand and lost his thumb. She left him before I was born. When I was about 10, my cousin and his dad died. I always thought it was an accident and on the same day. When I was old enough, I was told that his dad actually committed suicide and my cousin followed him couple months later. Truly devastated me, although I didn't know them well. Edit. Thank you for the warm words and also for sharing your similar stories with me. I've read all the replies. My grief is still there because I understand that with professional help both would maybe still be here today. It just wasn't common to seek help back then. I hope all of you are well. I'm so sorry. I know of a similar story. When I was a senior in high school, 2006 to 2007, one of my classmates lost her dad to suicide over winter break. Poor girl was so close to him, and it took her a couple of months to feel mentally okay enough to come back to school. She had just gotten back into a regular school routine when one day, she was pulled out of class. Her older brother had committed suicide. That was it for her, and she finished her schoolwork at home for the rest of the year. Obviously it was beyond devastating for her older sister, and their mother. And it broke our hearts that, while the rest of us were doing prom, prepping for graduation and college, etc., she was at home wrestling with deep grief. From what I can tell on Facebook, they are all doing well today, but man, I can't imagine what it was like to be the people most directly affected by that situation. Mine is more cool. That horrifying on the sense I'm proud of this one. My grandfather was an amazing guy. He was a sniper paratrooper in WW2. Always refused to talk about the army. I learned later that he was dishonorably discharged after injury. Turns out the sergeant in his squad was an absolute bastard. He had to go behind enemy lines to set a post up, and the plane was flying too low for a safe jump. He protested it to the sergeant, who proceeded to shove him out of the plane after calling him a coward. Both my grandfather and his spotter partner were seriously injured in the landing. His partner never knew him, was paralyzed and lost a leg. My grandfather broke both of his arm, hand, and some ribs. They both were rescued shortly after and taken to a military hospital. That's not what got him discharged, though. Turns out the sergeant showed up to visit them in the infirmary, and my grandfather punched him square in the face with his only good hand, twice. If his only army buddy we ever knew is to be believed, he was also visiting at the time, he floored the bastard. After that, and on top of his injuries, the army sent him home for the rest of the war. We found out later after he passed, and we had to go through his stuff, a bunch of newspaper and article clippings about the folks involved he had kept. The sergeant was also discharged after a similar incident cost the lives of 2 other members of his squad a year later that weren't so lucky. The man apparently drunk himself to death years later. We found all these written but unsent letters to his sergeant. We found photos of my grandfather's squad and the 2 that died with him. It was heartbreaking. I never knew any of this. He was such a fun, kind, and goofy guy, you'd never think anything like this would happen to him. Now I knew why my parents always said never to bring my up the army around him. Miss you, grandpa. I'd have punched the bastard too. That my cousin was actually my half brother. Mom got pregnant in college and my aunt and uncle adopted him. And that my dad wasn't my biological father. Mom and dad got divorced, she got pregnant by another man, and my dad wasn't able to have kids of his own, so they got remarried, and he raised me as his own. There are 2 posts here about a cousin that is also a half brother. And if you put the 2 together, what do you get? A full brother. When I was young I thought it was really nice that my nana lived with my aunt and her family since she was getting on a bit and it meant she was looked after and there were always people around. Aunt has 6 kids. Occasionally aunt would gripe about being the one looking after nana since aunt is also one of many kids and being young I sympathized, but given they all spent loads of time with nana too didn't think it was a big deal. You don't think about financial responsibility when you're young I think, just social and caring. Well it turns out the reason nana lives with aunt is because aunt and her husband convinced nana to put the house in their name so they could look after her affairs and sold it out from under her and invested the money in a pyramid scheme, so it's gone now. Because of this her siblings refuse to give aunt a penny towards looking after nana since it's her fault nana has no money or assets and instead pay to take nana out all the time, meals, shopping, activities so she doesn't go without, but they let aunt struggle under the weight of nana's general living expenses. Aunt's kids are all independent now, so they are not going to be impacted by money problems. Now I look back at her griping with annoyance and think what a terrible person she is. My uncle is believed to have murdered 2 Australian police officers in the late 80s. Holy shit. Walsh Street. Yep. Peter McEvoy. I met Peter at an RSL club I worked at in Newcastle and had quite a few interactions with him. He was playing the pokers the first time I met him and I saw his surname on his member's card when I went over for a payout and said I had friends that were McEvoys and maybe he was related, and he said he was estranged from his family because he was accused of doing something very bad that he didn't do. I was like, oh I'm okay. Then I googled him. Not so much letting on, as we found out by accident, but apparently my dad's first love and him got into a serious car crash when he was 25 and she died. He lived with her father 4 years after her death. He still occasionally comes to visit my dad, even 30 years later. We were always told he was a mentor, until my sister pressed my mom on the subject. One of my sisters is even named after the girl that died, middle name, and we never even knew about her until last year. None of us have ever brought it up with him. My friend was engaged to his first love in their early 20s when she passed from cancer. 10 years later, he got married to an amazing woman who honored his late fiancé in their wedding ceremony. Not a dry eye in the place. Oh man, that's awesome and heartbreaking all in one. My father was married with another woman before meeting my mother. They had a daughter and my dad loved her so much his wife started going crazy jealous. My dad noticed some strange behavior she had towards the girl, and when he tried to talk to her about it, she started arguing with him. He then left with his daughter to my uncle's house. She knew my dad would left the girl with my aunt while he was at work, so she called the police and said my aunt kidnapped her child. The police came in and took the girl away from my aunt. She immediately tried to call my dad, but the woman drove back home, put poison in her daughter's milk, and forced her to drink it. When my dad arrived, he found his daughter already dead and left alone. The woman was never ever found. My dad had never had justice for his first child. Kinda sad. Then when I was born my mother didn't mind to name me after my sister. We share the same name, and that's actually how I found it out. I asked my parents about my name, and they told me the whole story. Edit, typus. My grandma retired, and she still decided to work for her brother in his restaurant to save up money for when she dies. Funerals are, obviously, expensive. She insisted he would hold on to her paychecks and pay for her funeral when she dies. He never did. What a ducking asshole. How did the funeral end up being paid for? I think another family member paid for it. And the spot on a cemetery has to be paid for after the first 10 wife for another decade. My mom was trying to sue her uncle to pay for it, but they only had a verbal agreement about the funeral, so it wasn't successful. My dad did a whole load of work for a family member who said that he'd use some of the money he'd have paid my dad to buy the headstone. He didn't. My dad's headstone was repossessed. My father cheated on my mum with my sister and I's horse riding instructor. We'd always thought it ended amicably. We only found this out while mum was admitting to having contemplated driving off the road with us in the car as kids, as opposed to raising us as a single mum with no career or stable job. Edit, added a comma to prevent hilarious confusions. Oh man, I totally read this wrong at first and thought there was some horrible incestuous abuse going on. Either way shit, I'm so sorry. The reason I had a live-in babysitter when I was 5 that moved in at 2 AM was because my mom's cousin killed 2 kids and we ended up harboring his daughter during the trial. He's the only person on death row in my county. What happened to her after? My brother swears she stole my mom's jewelry and ran off. Mom says she didn't. But I'm pretty sure she's in town with kids of her own. Your mom's cousin wasn't bona fide, that's for sure. Grandma had 13 siblings. Of those 7 women are still alive. Once a year they have a sister day where they all, except one, are going somewhere to have fun. They've been doing this since they were teens. All but one sister, who has been lied to her whole life about Sister Day because she thinks it doesn't exist. This is supposed to have been started when that one sister borrowed something and didn't give it back. Or something trivial like that. We are all reminded, whenever we all get together, pre-pandemic, that we are not to talk about this because it will hurt that sister. Still can't wrap my head around how backstabbing bitchy some family members of mine are. Because this is just stupid. My step-grandfather has always been an alcoholic. As a child he even taught me how to mix his favorite drink. As kid at like 6 years old I would mix his drink as he liked and bring it into him in the living room. Don't ask what the drink was a mix of cause I literally can't remember, and my grandpa always acted funny. I always liked spending time with him cause I found him funny. So I never saw the bad side of his alcoholism and he never made me drink or anything, so overall he didn't have any negative impact on me at all. But before I was born he could get so drunk he threatened to kill my grandma, and when he got in a car accident and came home he was bleeding badly from his head and he started saying my granny shot him. He even threw out some of the wedding pictures my parents had. I never knew how horrible he was. Maybe cause he liked kids or something. He would make me cocoa and watch Garfield with me when I was a kid. He was never a bad influence in my life. So it was so weird to me when I found out these things about him. Before he died though, he really regretted drinking and he completely stopped. He became really depressed too until his granddaughter, biological, was born. He was so happy about his granddaughter. He died regretting everything, and a sober man who was happy to have been able to meet his one and only biological granddaughter. Regardless of everything he really changed in the end and everyone was really upset he died. My grandmother's first husband was extremely abusive, but this was the 60s, and he hid it well. She couldn't file for divorce without proof of injury, so she beat herself in the face with a slipper to get away. She was 21 or 22 or so with 3 young children. I'm 23 right now, and I could never imagine. She was such a strong lady, I miss her. Edit, just wanted to say thanks for the awards. I'm glad times have changed for women, but we still have a long to go. My great-great-grandma couldn't get a divorce for cruelty. It was the 1910s, so she left her husband and moved in with another man. Her husband divorced her for infidelity, which she gleefully admitted. That my favorite cousin wasn't missing. All I knew growing up, he was 13 years older than me, was that he would come and go at it. He lived with us when I was a baby, and after he moved out he would visit every 6 months or so out of the blue, but we never visited him or called him. His visits were one of my favorite things in the world. I loved him like a brother. By the time I was a teenager I did understand that he had issues with his parents. They had kicked him out at 13 and my parents took him in. But that kind of childhood messes with you. In between visits to my parents he avoided the rest of the family, moved out, and didn't hold jobs for long, which is why my parents didn't always know where he was. But in my later teens he stopped coming over at all. I asked repeatedly if anyone had heard from him, and I was told no. I asked about contacting him and was told no one had a number or address for him. He would come around when he felt like it. But it stretched on 4 years. I really worried he was dead and I really missed him. In my later 20s I finally found out that everyone knew where he was the whole time. He was in prison for murder. From what I hear it was actually somewhat justified. He was defending his new wife, who I never got to meet. I also found out some super shitty things about how the extended family sided with his ducked up parents and refused to help him or his wife when he got arrested. And that they shamed my dad into not helping either. I tried to send a message to him in prison, but I don't know if he ever got it. I wish he knew that I didn't turn my back on him for decades like everyone else did. I just didn't know. My uncle was raped as a young boy and my grandparents not only didn't believe him, but beat him and disowned him for bringing such lies into our house. Sad thing is, I was raped as a kid, and while dealing with that my dad told me what happened to my uncle. I assume so I didn't feel so alone. My uncle is still the only one I know personally who has experienced the same trauma as me, and I'm not meant to know so can't talk to him about it. Edit. Typical this has blown up edit, but seriously, whoa. However, I'm not gonna bring up someone else's trauma to them. I'm particular in who in my life I tell. If I knew someone I trusted had been telling other people I'd be hurt by that, so not gonna do that. Thank you to those sending some love. I'm not alone now though, I have people I can talk to which is nice. Going to be starting a group thing of therapy where I'll be able to speak to other abuse victims. I think that will help too. My grandparents spent some time in lockup after my grandpa killed their newborn in a shell shock induced frenzy. They were jailed because they buried her body in a cave and tried to hide it. My mom and her siblings were all adopted out very young and went back to their parents around 11 years or so later. I knew that growing up, but didn't know why until I was older. That's so terribly sad. A genuine tragedy. I can understand why they wouldn't tell you until you were a little older. To put it shortly, my family tree is more like a very long branch. Yes, we have the genetic defects to prove it. That's not uncommon where I'm from. Hundreds of tiny isolated rural communities with little easy access led to a lot of accidental inbreeding. World-class geneticists flock to my province to study all the weird shit that pops up. It's gotten to the point that people in other nations have found out their family was from here when they get a disorder or defect that was only present in this one family from this certain bay. That's really interesting. I won't ask for an example disorder, since that might reveal your location, but it's interesting there's such highly unique mutations in humans. My grandfather, who was my mother's stepfather, molested my mother when she was 6, and he repeatedly raped her older sister. My grandmother knew about it and kicked him out only for a short while. Then she took him back in and kicked out her 14-year-old daughter, my mom's older sister, and sent her to live with her stepmother and biological father, knowingly full well her stepmother beat the crap out of her on a regular basis. My mother told me when I was an adult and complaining about how my grandma was sexist because she never let me go fishing with my grandpa and always let my brother go. Turns out my grandma knew he had a thing for little girls and at least tried to make sure my sister and I were never alone with him. Thankfully neither my sister nor I were molested by him. Even though my mother tried repeatedly to get me alone with him. I also realized in my 30s, after a decade of therapy and different meds, that my mother was severely abusive towards me via emotional incest. She found out I was being sexually abused by my older brother and made it a point to leave me alone with him as often as possible and make me ask him and be alone with him to use family items like the computer or PlayStation. She would wait until he was done and then make me go give her a back rub while she was naked and sleep in her bed with her. She and my aunt both swear they're not messed up and still hang out with my grandma and grandpedo. I don't really talk with that side of the family anymore. Edited, some typos. My cousins used to stay with us a lot. I remember my male cousin was just a small baby when he first came to us. He would scream and scream and scream all night, and mum put him in my room, so I used to spend the night cuddling him or playing peekaboo. My other cousin was my age, 5, at the time. I found out later, my auntie was a heroin addict and a sex worker. My cousins were the result of clients and my male cousin was actually born whilst my auntie was heavily using, and he was going through withdrawal after his birth. My grandparents ended up flying him from Wales and taking custody of them as well as putting my auntie on a plane and leaving with all of them. It was one of the saddest days of my life that I never understood. I thought they were going to be my brother and sister and wasn't sure why all of a sudden they were taken from me. Edit. Wow, thank you so much for the awards. I've just woken up and have loads to read through. For those asking, my auntie made it out of that life. She prefers to be alone and doesn't have anything really to do with the family. She still lives in the same village as my grandparents. Them being taken was always something that upset me so much, but was swept under the rug so much I thought I was being dramatic. Seeing all your comments is so validating, and I thank you for that.